Great. Thank you, everyone, for attending this month's meeting of the Governor's Task Force on Broadband. Thank you again, once again, for making a little bit of time in your schedule for this really important topic. So this month, you'll see we have a couple of presentations. So it's going to be kind of rapid fire for a little bit, but we're going to talk about the homework just briefly to kind of set the framework before we get into those presentations, and then we'll move back into really working through the topics all together. So I'm going to hand it over to Jaren really quickly to do roll call and any light housekeeping that needs to be done, because we are, of course, on Zoom. And yeah, so I'll hand it back over to you, Jaren.
Thank you, Brittany. Good to see everyone. Thank you for attending. Of course, welcome to the Governor's Task Force on Broadband Access. Today is March 9th. Just like to remind everyone that this is a public meeting. It is being recorded. We have a meeting agenda available on the Commission, the PSC events calendar. It should have also been attached to the Outlook invite that you got. I know we're all well aware of this at this point, but if you could just maintain muted when we're not, or excuse me, when you're not speaking, that would be great. Help maintain that audio quality. I'm going to do a roll call now, and if you could just say here or present or something to let me know that you're here when your name is called, that'd be great. Brittany Byer.
Here.
Marta Bechtel.
I'm here.
Tom Boron.
Here.
Chad Young.
Here.
Jean Pauck.
Here.
Celeste Flynn.
Here.
Rachel Shemlin.
Present.
Brett Schupner.
Here.
Jose Martinez.
Here.
Chris Meyer.
Here.
Chet Streeb. I think he was going to be missing. Chris Herjong. Emily Dittmar.
Here.
Jennifer Schilling.
Here.
Andrew Faust.
Here.
Matthew Gabriels. Dr. Baker.
Present.
Pico, thank you. Lori Collins.
Here.
Gail Hike.
Here.
Shannon Clark. Sal Carranza.
Here.
State Representative Beth Myers. State Representative Jeffrey Mursaw. State Senator Howard Marklein. State Senator Brad Path. And we've actually got a new member of the task force. I'm going to briefly introduce Justin Hebner. Welcome to the task force. Obviously, I think I saw you join in. If you just want to let us know you're here, and I would offer up the opportunity to just briefly introduce yourself. Let us know who you are and what you do. Justin?
Yeah, I'm the guy that's bouncing up and down during these calls. I got a treadmill desk here in January. But I'm the CEO at Solaris. We're about 16,000 customers right in the middle Wisconsin, Wisconsin Rapids area, kind of that area, 125 years old. Started obviously on the telephone side of things, and then have become an ISP as well as a video provider on that piece. But so I've been on the last couple of meetings, but great to officially meet everyone on this side. So.
Thank you, Justin. And we've got one other new member who I don't believe is with us today, but I'll briefly introduce him and then maybe next time give him the opportunity. But we have Douglas Cox, who is the Director of Land Management for the Menominee Indian Tribe of Wisconsin as well. We had a few that I didn't hear from, so I'm going to quickly go through them and then we can wrap up roll call. Chet Streeb, Chris Herjong, Matthew Gabriels, Shannon Clark, Representative Beth Myers, Representative Mursaw, Senator Marklein, and Senator Path. I don't believe I missed anyone, but if I did, could you let me know? All right, I'm not hearing anything. Thank you, everyone. I'll turn it back over to you, Brittany.
Great, thank you, Jaron. And welcome, Justin. I have seen you on the other calls and envious of your treadmill. So there is that. I'm going to hand it back over to Kristen because we wanted to briefly kind of work through the homework and use that as kind of the framing and setting for the next part of the conversation. So I'll hand it over to Kristen.
Thank you very much, Brittany. And I am going to drop a link to the Google document that we are using as our temporary workspace into the chat. And I'll also screen share, but feel free to navigate over there. We will be using it in our discussion later on today, and you can follow along on the slides, or if you're like me, you can look ahead on the slides as well. So I'll screen share. I want to thank everybody for those of you that we had a good response for our homework. For those of you that were able to do the homework, thank you very much for doing that in advance. If you have not had a chance and you still wish to, that survey is still up. And just as a reminder, your responses on that survey are completely anonymous. We don't record any data about who is answering and or location data. That is all downloaded, the answers, not any identifying information. It is all downloaded and preserved for the purposes of open records. And with our temporary workspace as well, what we write on this today will be downloaded and preserved for public record. But when you return to this website tomorrow, if you were to do that, you'll see blank spaces. So with that, I'm going to quickly go over our homework so that we have plenty of time for our speakers today. Our first homework question we asked was around local readiness themes. What are some of the common pain points that we see with regards to local readiness for a broadband project? And we had 20 different numbered answers that were unique. I grouped these into themes to make it a little bit easier to go over in the time that we have today. The first pain point was public support and community awareness. Is the local community aware that they have a broadband problem? Have they identified broadband as a necessity and identified a problem, and perhaps even the scope of the problem within their community? That was one of the common themes across all answers. And second, how do communities establish broad support from their residents for broadband projects? Needs may be realized as urgent among some residents, but not other residents. Second was funding. Funding is a common pain point, and we had 7 unique answers across this theme. Do the local communities have money allocated to help broadband was a common concern. Are they aware that they should have money allocated? Funding limitations was another concern or theme that we saw. Communities will work with ISPs to develop a project, and sometimes there's confusion about who or how projects are funded. Local funding again came across as a theme with regards to both readiness and execution. So not necessarily paying for or funding infrastructure, but some of the other costs that are associated with putting together a broadband project. Then the actual expense of creating a broadband network in a community, the amount of dollars it requires to do that are often a hidden cost that communities are not aware of. And then finally, we had a couple of folks that also highlighted something we talked about last time, the end users costs. What are the end users costs, and how much will we be expecting or will a project require our end users to pay for subscriptions? The third one is a term called task leadership. So leadership comes in many forms. And if you've, many of us have looked at organizational communication and human resources, task leadership is a specific form of leadership that's involved in scheduling meetings, putting agendas together, the actual work of leading the work behind the scenes of getting tasks done. So there will frequently be local leaders who are identified to help with a project, but not necessarily capable of or have the capacity to schedule meetings, put together agendas, track notes, and do all of the tasks related to keeping a project moving forward. That was identified by several respondents. And then local data and access to local data and information is a common theme, and technical knowledge, understanding of how broadband is developed, and then just simply technically knowing what the terms are, what the language is like, literally speaking the same language. So that was our homework question 1. Homework question set number 2 was around well-planned project themes. And here we had 5 common themes. The first one was subsets, process, knowledge, and experience. And this was kind of a two-way street. We had several respondents who identified communities as needing to understand the process of putting together a project and the process of building out a network. The other side of the coin, we had a couple of people who identified a lack of information that providers, or lack of access to information among providers about how do local processes work and how do they differ across communities. Communities, of course, vary in terms of the times of year they're able to consider projects or how they go through approval process. While there are state and federal regulations that are common across communities, each individual community has a way of functioning that is unique to itself when it's bringing any project, be it broadband or housing, online, and kind of a lack of ready information around that providers need. Technical knowledge, again, came up as another pain point. Uncertainty regarding financial or time commitments. We had a couple of people comment that there is among certain communities a wait and see approach. Less experience mean that they might be more inclined to see how broadband develops in nearby communities or other similar communities rather than acting immediately on an issue. So that wait and see and wait and learn really from other communities. Mismatched expectations regarding time, regarding funding, regarding roles was another common theme. And then workforce and legal constraints, workforce constraints in terms of we've got a very tight labor market in Wisconsin. We might not have the people needed to build a network, even if everything else lines up. And then legal constraints, who owns property, who is in charge of getting easements, how easily are easements granted, and things along the legal line. And finally, our third question set was around recruiting a team. And I know we didn't use the word team, but that came ready to mind when I was reading the answers. 2 major themes here. First one, network and partnership constraints. Network in terms of providers looking to build a network or regions learning to build a network, but then also the other way up, local communities learning to build a network as well. Just mismatch in communication and different recruiting styles or a lack of an easy way to recruit and build a team. And then local leadership contacts, that should say, instead of contracts. I proofread this several times and of course one slipped through. Constraints related to reliance on a local volunteer leadership team was one common theme across many respondents. Local leaders in this area, whether they're county board members or local village administrators or trustees, not administrators, are essentially leaders that are volunteers and often working a full-time job and not necessarily capable of taking on a large role in this. So this local leadership constraint. Constraints related to local talent identification. Several respondents pointed out that it's always the same people at the table, whether they are local or whether it is a provider coming in. There is an untapped wealth of talent in a lot of our communities, and how do we surface those potential participants? And finally, again, constraints related to technical expertise and local experience as well. So those were our 3 themes. I want to thank everybody very much for our 3 questions. Thank everybody very much for participating. If you haven't had a chance to fill that out, we still will be collecting responses, and that will, your response, even after today's meeting, will be useful in helping us put together the final report. So with that, Brittany, can I turn it back over to you?
Sure. I think we have just a second to, if there's any responses to those findings from the task force members, if you wanted to just respond, but it's homework. So I think we said as much as we needed to, but just opening it up to the task force at this moment for just quick responses if anyone felt the need. I had a feeling that we would feel sufficed. So I want to turn it over first to Danielle Jones. Last time we met, we talked through the WEDC PSC broadband pilot that happened just briefly. And so we wanted to hear a little bit more about that process. So if everyone remembers, it was stood up, I think, in the fall of 2020 to really match need that was on the ground right at that point. So I'm going to hand it over to Danielle. We're going to try to do these quickly. There'll be a brief point afterwards that you can ask her some questions if you have it. But once again, I'm turning it over to you, Danielle.
Okay, let's see. This is the first time I've done a share screen on Zoom, so we'll see how this works. Okay, let's see here. So can you guys see my screen? Yep.
I can,
I'm-
yes.
Okay, great.
Mhm.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So my name is Danielle Jones. I'm a Director of Rural Initiatives at the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation. And in 2020, I was one of the broadband connectors for the Broadband Connectors pilot. The goal of that pilot was to help increase readiness to apply for existing broadband opportunities. The timeframe was generally fall of 2020 to December of 2020. We started in about September or so, but the actual work time was started in October, so it was roughly 2 months of work. We received 96 applications and we chose 6 cohorts. Now, the reason we chose only 6 was because we did not have the applications in place at that time, and we weren't sure how much work was going to be required or what necessarily the assistance they would need. The applications spanned basically people who were novices at broadband. They spanned those who had experience. So we went from those who were not sure where to start to those who had applied or partnered on applications, may have received funds, may or likely were not awarded. What we focused on were the mid-tier. So they had discrete needs, they had a plan of action, they needed technical assistance to get that extra boost to get to that next level. So the cohort needs varied with this group of 6. So everything from funding for expansion, assessments, or analyses. They needed structured plans or structured analyses. They were interested in how to convene stakeholders, who to convene. They were curious about getting some technical expertise. They were looking at some data gathering or survey work. And then they were looking to make connections. And the connections were pretty broad. Then we did a set of intake questions. So with each one, we did an intake set of questions to find out kind of what they had done before, because there was a lot that in our application process, we couldn't kind of dive into. What we found out was that there was a lot more information gap in each one of their work processes. So they didn't understand the process for applying, what kind of were the steps to take, when to take them, how to take them. They didn't know what was needed, how to engage with, grant people who had grants, agencies that had grants, how to interact and engage with providers, and any of the other partners. So they didn't know who their local partners were. So who were the people that they should be bringing together, whether it was in their committee or as they were approaching providers. They didn't know who to bring those together. They also had a lot of questions about the providers in general. Who were the providers? Where were the providers? We got questions on did they have territories? And then there were a lot of questions at Starlink. So if you guys remember in 2020, Starlink was really coming out in Wisconsin. So we had a lot of questions on what it is, what it's not, what it can do. And then of course, there were a lot of questions on funding. And as you guys remember, RDOF was being rolled out around that time. So a lot of questions on RDOF, a lot of questions on what other kinds of funding there were. That crossed everything from what can we do for grant matching, what can communities do, what do the providers get, and who's involved. As we started to work with these cohort members, what we started to realize was that one of the biggest hurdles that they were going to face was funds for their matches. These were for communities and by communities. How are they going to get that match together? So before I dive into the needs that were in the applications themselves, I want to point out some things. So first of all, this is not scientific. What I did was I approached this as a rational person interpretation, and that's a lot of because of how the applicants were responding to questions. So not scientific. I also want to point out that the needs are not mutually exclusive. So if somebody mentioned that they needed to do a strategic plan, but then they also needed more granulated data to do that, I counted both in each one of those separate areas. And then obviously because of that, we're not going to add up to about 96 different it needs to be identified. So once we have that clear, we're set to go. So the first thing that I looked at, which was not part of the assignment, but I looked at to see how many applicants had committees already developed. Between 14 to 17 either had none or had very new committees. Some of those didn't even mention that they had a committee. So by looking at the context, we looked at it, say they probably don't have one available. And then I looked to see within those who had some experience. So, and I'm looking for something where it's just maybe they did a little bit of outreach, but not a whole lot. So between 12 and over 15 had some minimal, either they had reached out to a provider or they maybe reached out to a couple providers. Maybe they had talked to somebody about a grant or something. But other than that, there wasn't a body of work to show that they had this experience, this massive experience. After that, they're looking at that there were 5 common categories or themes that these responses fell into. So the first one is accessibility and availability, adequacy. So that's talking about, is it reliable? Can they reach it? Affordability, is it too expensive for people in their communities? And then adoptability was not one that was actually mentioned throughout any of the responses. However, we can look at it and say that it was implied because of the terms fixed income and low income. So as people talked about the income levels of their communities, those could be implied that there was a question about adoptability. The 5th was attraction, and it really was geared around competition coming in, but also if they didn't have other members who were providing service, how could they attract them in? I want to point out that the first 4 are actually as part of survey work for communities. Those are the first 4 that have been identified that as a community surveys, that's what they can focus on so that they can approach and say, these are what our needs are. The 5th one was a surprise for me when I looked at that. So jumping into the mentions. So I did this by the number of mentions. Again, not scientific. So when it came to adequacy or speed, there were 35 almost distinct mentions. When it came to adequacy on reliability, there were 28 mentions. When it talked about access, so I was looking at whether they were unserved, underserved, were they just saying that they had a satellite provider? Did they have a single provider? And then I counted it as an unserved or underserved, so that was an access issue, and we had about 44 mentions on that. We also had access related to topography, and we had 33 mentions. Most of them talked about woods, valleys, hills, etc. So we had 33 mentions on those. We looked at affordability, so that was the customer's ability to afford. There are 23 mentions on affordability from the customer's perspective. What a rational person could say was from the customer perspective. There's also a lot of comments on affordability and attraction regarding provider ROI. So they talked about not being able to attract providers because of a lack of ROI. And so that translated to that affordability for the providers. There are 34 distinct mentions of that in there. And that was usually when we're looking directly for ROI in that mention. Affordability as far as attraction, so it's a cost to expand. There were several that mentioned that. There were about 7 that mentioned that. And then again, on adoptability, you're going to hear this a lot. It's implied in the comments that they made about rural incomes, and there were 6 mentions of that. So I felt that it was important to put that on one of the spreadsheets. There were some interesting highlights that came out of this. So that up there takes care of the general. These are the number of touches that we had. There are go back up here. There are a bunch that I don't have on there because they were either under 5 mentions, maybe under 10 mentions, so they didn't really come up. And there were some that are amalgamated, and you're going to find out those in the highlights where I did take them and put them all together because, again, I went through the rational person interpretation to say these can kind of come together in this one area. So with that being said, some of the comments that stuck out, and there were highlights. So one of them was somebody had said that the provider had received funding, but the ISP told them they were, quote, too rural. There were several comments about the financial woes or business practices of some companies, which were leading to some questions about reliability if the company was going to be there, reliability if the service was going to be available. Competition came out as being a double-edged sword. So more providers, and some of the responses meant that there was a fragmented approach to working with the providers for the community. So that means the communities were saying, we're having to look at different ways that we are going to approach each provider, what they need, what they're looking for, what they're asking for. And that led to some attraction concerns for them. On the other side of the coin, though, fragmented communities, they were talking about having to need a fragmented approach. So again, it's this fragmentation to say, depending on where we're at, who comes into our territory or our area, we're going to have a lot of different ways of doing that. And that was kind of something that they were alluding to that was a difficult thing to maneuver. Additionally, some communities felt smaller providers were typically more eager to work with communities, but they may have had a tougher time at getting into new territory. And I'm deliberately leaving out company names, but they did mention some companies in some of those. Resources were another thing. They talked about everything from the technical assistance to strategies to funding. And they're saying we need that information. So this is one of those amalgamations. There are 15 mentions of that across that spectrum. Data was another component. They were saying that there was not enough data about what is available and what is needed. So they're saying, what is available currently from the provider standpoint, and then what is needed. They didn't have enough data. They did specifically mention the census block data. They're talking about how it can be, a little bit difficult to find out who is truly served and who is not because of census block data. They talked about survey data not being available. Usually that was from their own perspective, that they didn't know what was available there. And they also there was one mention about expansion plans. And that expansion plan was really about saying, we don't know what our providers their expansion plans are. So again, if this is amalgamated, but there were about 8 comments on data that were brought up. Another thing that came up were data caps were a hindrance. There were a few mentions of that. It kind of covered around accessibility, availability, and affordability. I do believe that a lot of providers probably pulled back from their data caps during the height of the pandemic, but I don't know if that's still the case now. But I wanted to bring that up because that had been mentioned. Additionally, there was some discussion about future-proof technology as being expensive, more so when there was a topography issue. So if they had a line of sight issue where wireless was not going to work for them, they talked, it was obvious that the topography was going to hinder that, but at the same time, if they were to do a fiber optic option, it was going to add to their cost. So that was pretty consistent throughout. Again, the income limits, 6 mentions, adoptability could be an issue there. With the tribes, so there were a few tribes that had responded and been part of this. So the biggest thing from them was that if they're working with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, that there's going to be a timeline increase. So they have to take into consideration that added time frame before they can even apply for a grant. So that needed to be built in. And then there were several mentions too of cost to communities can be prohibitive. And that was kind of a broad category where, they were like, we think we need to come up with this that's prohibitive for our community. So with all of that, that's pretty much the highlights on the data that was in there that I could call out of there. It sounds all doom and gloom, but there are some bright spots, and I want to remind everybody of. So a lot of this information is amalgamated. So, what we learned from the cohort is that there were needs that they came in with, but at the same time, there was the reality of another set of needs that needed to be worked with on them. So we don't know what we don't know until we learn it. And so I want to remind people, this is their application, this is what they're saying, but at the same time, there could be some other information that they do need. We also have some excellent providers in the state. Cochrane Co-op basically worked with one of our cohort communities. They did receive a grant for that community, so that was a big win for us. Novato, Lynx, Amherst Communications, Mosaic, 24/7 Telecom, West Wisconsin Telecom. That's just the tip of the iceberg. There are a lot of really good providers. And the other thing I want to really highlight too is community buy-in and support is really critical to success. That's what we learned from the cohorts. That's what we learned from our best practices. So just, as people are moving forward, that helping them come together is probably a really important part. That is pretty much the end of my presentation. So happy to take any questions.
Great. Thanks, Danielle. Yes, we definitely have time for a question or two.
Hi, this is Sal Carranza. Great presentation. I'm sorry I got a little late because I'm dealing with something here in my home, but I got the end of your presentation. I know there were some what we could call barriers to be able to expand broadband. Any of the surveys or any people you talked to had any solutions or any suggestions about how to address those particular concerns?
Are you referring to expanding service into the unexpanded
For
area?
example,
Or how do you mean by expand?
You mentioned, for example, there were some some places where it was difficult because of the topography or because of, lack of data or because of, perhaps other issues that you mentioned were difficult, like the density of the population that might be able to be helped, or they said they were too rural or things like that. Was there any suggestions of how or what can be done to be able to provide that service and how to remove those barriers? I don't know if there was anything or.
So, yep. So as far as the analysis of the applications, that really wasn't covered, but with the cohorts that we worked with, that wasn't one of their primary issues. But again, when we were working with them, we were recommending that they pull the information together that they had to show what was needed. And that was through either survey work or assessments of that type. And then to do that outreach to the provider and then work with them on looking at funds. So it really is, there's no way that we can add more people into an area to try to increase that ROI, but there are opportunities that if they work together to pinpoint where that need is, then they can work with the provider and work to try and get the funding together to get that covered, because it's just going to be expensive. The other option, again, and then, like I said, it's a double-edged sword, is to bring in other companies that could come in. But again, if they're looking at, like they said, wireless, then they were going to have issues potentially if there were trees or hills involved. So it was really about saying how they can maybe attract others in. But like I said, then that was a fragmented approach that communities had to take when they were working with the different providers.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you so much for bringing that information together for us. Clarity on what the applications look like has been kind of a burning desire. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do that. So we're going to move on. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, no worries, happy to. It was 96 applications of reading, so it was fun.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to move on to our next series of presentations covering the National Telecommunications and Information Administration's building capacity through broadband projects cycle, which is already closed. So this is kind of looking at a process that has existed and possibly having some elements that we can learn from. So Kristen put into the chat some of the items that you should be listening for. So, we're trying to get to the possible solutions or common pain points that are coming up, and that will be part of the conversation at the turn of the rest of the meeting. So I'm going to hand this over to Jerry Klein at this point. And you can introduce yourself and put together your presentation. You should have sharing capabilities, so it shouldn't be an issue.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Thanks. Good afternoon. So I guess my target is to explain a little bit about what we did in the past, right, Brittany? Okay. So after the financial situations of 2008, there was money put aside for broadband at that time. I think it was $4 billion. It was mostly through, there was 2 avenues that it was delivered through at the federal government. And we ended up applying for the BCCB grant, which is broadband capability. It's in your, the acronym is BCCB. We worked with a couple of, put together kind of a consortium, and I think some of the people that might have been involved in it are also on this call. In Wausau, I worked with the CIO from North Central Technical College, Chet Streeb. He and I had done, had worked together to share information over the past. We have some similar systems. I run a group called the City County IT Commission in Wausau, which is a shared service group that supports the city, the county, North Central Healthcare, and the law enforcement agencies in the kind of central Wisconsin area. So Chet has a property here, and he has North Central Technical College has a couple of properties. We have, my organization supports probably about 25 or 30 properties just in the Wausau area. So, city parks, fire departments, police stations, courthouse, city hall, all of that stuff. So Chet and I started talking to people at UW-Madison, people with WISCNet, and we ended up putting together kind of a big full package. I think it ended up being about $50 million. And so it was UW-Madison, WISCNet. In Wausau, Chet and I formed a group called the Wausau Community Area Network. There was another group in Platteville. The UW wanted to connect UW Platteville. They also wanted to connect UW Superior. WISCNet had an interest to get to us in Wausau. They had fiber going through here, but didn't have any electronic presence here. So they had to build a POP in Wausau. They ended up adding a 10 gigabit POP here. Chet and I also then later on, as time went on, partnered with the school district. And then the private company involved was Packerland, which is now called Astria. And the whole package was like a whole bunch of different projects all bundled together. What Packerland ended up doing was they were basically the fiber builder, and they built a couple 100 miles of fiber starting north of Anago, and it went down to Wittenberg, over to Wausau, through Stevens Point, over to Marshfield, over to Eau Claire, up to Superior, to UW Superior. So it connected a couple of UW campus properties. Here in our area, it went through past UW Stevens Point at Wausau and the UWSP campus down in Point. And then there was a separate fiber run from Platteville to downtown to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And in a couple of places, CANs were built, community area networks were built. The one that that Chet and I focused on was in our town. We ended up doing 11 miles of fiber. We connected about 15 or 18 properties, I think, at the beginning. And basically what we did was we created kind of a Z through town, a Z shape, physical looking at a Z shape. And we connected up as many properties as we could with the least amount of fiber. We ran 96 count fiber through the community. We connected at the State Patrol building in Rib Mountain, where WISCNet had a point of presence, built a point of presence for us. And then we ended up connecting a number of school district properties, the Tech College, the UW two-year campus here, a number of city and county facilities like our Parks Department, our Highway Department, our Emergency Management Government. I already had a ring downtown, so we connected to that ring at the library building, and that hooked us to the City Hall and Courthouse, and to the police station, and to the fire stations. And then as we went through town, we also ran laterals into Newman Catholic schools. We ran laterals into two of the hospital and 3 clinics over on the west side of town. And I think at the end of the day, we had about 18 properties on it by the time we were done. Then we ended up deciding to extend it to a farm campus that NTC had north of town. And we ran another 2 miles up to there. One of the cool things that we did was we worked with a couple of other providers and did fiber swaps, which ended up working out really well. Cellcom, its parent company, is Insight. They had an interest in getting from the hospital campus over towards the corner of the city of Wausau that has the Tech College at it. And so what we ended up we're able to work out through the deal was when we dug a hole in the ground to put our fiber in and conduit in, we ended up putting in 2 96 count fibers right side by side, one for us and one for Insight. And then in exchange for that, Insight gave us 6 strands of fiber that went across the other side of town. So we were able to make a fiber ring for backup and redundancy purposes. That went really well. It was a pretty rocky political process at the time. I don't know if any of you were involved in broadband at the time, but it was a number of telecom companies were not very happy with it and challenged it at the Joint Finance Committee meeting in Madison, and we were able to get through that. So today that CAN fiber is working really well for us. We have very high speed connections. And we have been continuing to extend it every year. The CAN was created as a separate legal entity. And so we have a board of directors. We meet about every 2 months now. We used to meet, of course, during the project, we were meeting every 2 weeks. The school district, another school district got involved. And we've connected up a couple of other medical clinics, but basically our focus is government, city and county government, education facilities, and nonprofit medical facilities, healthcare facilities, I should say. And it's been an awesome opportunity for us. It's worked out really well. If you guys are interested in seeing a map, I can do that. I think hopefully what I provided is going to give you some good background on it. And I'd be glad to answer questions about it, how we're structured, or what kind of challenges we ran into. I can answer any of those questions.
Great, thank you, Jerry. Any quick questions before we move on to the next presenter?
Jerry, this is Jose. Just a quick question. Did you find any situations where you that there may have been some difficulties in kind of navigating through perhaps local regulations or state regulations as it relates to, in some instances, when you're having to create the infrastructure, whether it been fiber optic or any other type of cabling, and did you find that maybe navigating through some of these regulations were some of the challenges or unperceived challenges that you find yourself in?
We didn't really run into a lot of regulations. I ran into a lot of political challenges. There was some opportunities. It would have been really good to have a couple of the carriers work together on it, but the carriers are just not designed to work together because they're competitors.
Sure.
So I had challenges with that. I think we would have had some great opportunities to do that. We did run into one regulatory issue. We needed to attach fiber to a conduit for the fiber to a bridge downtown, and it had some nesting birds in it. So we had to take about 6 weeks off while they finished nesting. The DOT was another partner that worked out super well. We found out that they had about 3 miles of conduit that was open underneath Highway 39. And they allowed us to pull our fiber through there, which saved a ton of money. And in exchange for that, I gave them 12 strands of fiber to connect up 4 of their interchanges so that they could computer control all the lights at the key intersections that go onto the interstate. So I was expecting challenges with, getting that kind of stuff done, but everybody had something to get out of it. So that was beneficial.
Were there any lessons learned in trying to bring competitors together? I realize competitors, obviously, sometimes there's opposing forces, but were there any aha moments when competitors were able to work together and be able to move the project forward?
Insight and Astria work together really well, and they're definitely competitors. Both of them had something to gain out of it, like I said earlier, and they were keenly aware of that, and so they worked out really well together. Some of the other more national carriers were the ones that didn't want to work together. So local carriers were easier to work with, I guess, is the short answer.
Great. We can take one more quick question. Great. Well, Jerry, thank you for explaining the process to us. I think there's a lot inside of it that we can learn from. Quickly turning over to Dan. I apologize if I say your last name wrong, Dargel. It's probably wrong. But I'm going to hand it over to you. It's related to the same process, but a different part of the state and probably a little bit of a different process.
Hello, my name's Dan Dargle. I am the technical representative for the Platteville Community Area Network. I'm also the project manager. I was the project manager during the CCI portion of the BCCB project that was in Platteville, just the Platteville portion of it. And I'm also the network architect for Unity Platteville. So in Platteville, the Platteville School District had a fiber optic network that they had previously installed throughout the city, and it connected their facilities as well as the public library. as well as getting them access to an ISP. The school district had visions of sharing that fiber as a CAN. And I had also put together some potential maps in the event that down the road that some monies or grants might become available or some opportunity. And that was primarily, I think, due to what successes we had seen from the SYNC CAN in the Chippewa Valley area. There was also, a fair amount of interest at the community level on doing things for broadband. Platteville is a fairly rural in that it is far enough away from Madison. Main claim to fame here is the UW-Platteville being an engineering campus and needing technical and high-speed internet for those programs. So UW Extension was the one that really, I think, approached us about the potential for the BTOP grant. There were actually 3 grants that they applied for. There was the Comprehensive Community Infrastructure, which is basically infrastructure, fiber optics. There was one called Sustainable Broadband Adoption, which was maybe more of an outreach thing. It also had components to reach out to vulnerable populations and things like that. And the Community Computing Center was another one. And that was basically building computer facilities in libraries and various other public venues so that people who didn't have infrastructure to their home or business could potentially utilize some central resource. We brought, or I was one of the ones that presented to the city council what UD Extension was proposing, and also another entity called BEST, which was Building Economic Strength Together. It's was an organization in Platteville for economic development, did the presentation on the other 2 proposals. Also, Southwest Regional Planning was a big proponent in the area, as well as WISNET and the UW. Another thing that was driving this was UW-Platteville being a bit isolated, was really facing bandwidth limitations. Exponential costs were projected for growing that bandwidth. It was hindering our capabilities. We needed also to upgrade our backbone on campus to single mode fiber, which would have very larger bandwidth carrying capabilities. So UW-Platteville really see this as essential to their future, being able to break out of the bandwidth bottleneck that we were limiting traffic on campus, and it was preventing us from deploying or cooperating with the other UWs. The city also didn't really have a network of their own. They just had local DSL connections to various facilities, and they really needed something to tie things together. I also worked with contractors to get some quotes together. And there really was no local competition in the loop because CenturyLink was the local ILEC, and they also were the cable TV provider in the area. So there wasn't that traditional competition. And UWX provided excellent grant writers and great meetings brainstorming all the different things outside the box that we need to consider. So like Gary said, Platteville, Eau Claire, Wausau, and Superior were involved in this. I believe all of the 3 grants were awarded to us. And I believe there was community or a computing lab that was done, I believe, in the Menominee Nation. For us, the 3 main anchor institutions that were involved was the Platteville School District, which they contributed their existing fiber optic network in kind. The University of Wisconsin-Platteville, $100,000 in cash, and the city of Platteville for $100,000 in cash. The whole project was nearly $1 million when you consider the in-kind values. UDI extension with CCI, which was the parent company of Astria or Packerland, was responsible for building middle mile fiber from Madison to Platteville. That was essential for this. We didn't want an isolated CAN. That allowed DOT, WISNET, UD system, and also Packerland, which is now Astria, to bring services into Platteville. Packerland was the private partner so that other private entities could contract with them to get access in Platteville. The CAN was tried several times to secure a private partner within town, but we just really couldn't get any interest in doing so. That is probably our biggest problem that we even face today. So PCAN's a nonprofit. We have dark fiber. We do not provide internet. It's just a fiber optic transport to connect facilities within Platteville and get access to ISP points of presence in town. Members have to, or ISPs have to light the fiber. We just provide dark fiber. Membership fees are tiered based on FTE count of the institution. This is one of the things that we found key to avoid locking out smaller entities. So the costs from participating in the CAN are rather exponential based on the number of full-time employees you have. So say an institution with 5 employees might only pay a couple $100 a year versus a full member has to pay whatever the remaining budget is. And that often runs $5,000 to $7,000 a year. One of the things that is key to understand is the members own the network, they own the fiber, and so they own the fiber up to these points of presence. So they have the ability to choose from multiple ISPs at these points of presence, rather than having to have ISPs build fiber optics that they own individually to the members. This allows for a lot better competition. You're not doing a lot of, providers aren't having to build their own infrastructure. It avoids a lot of the problems of being able to compete amongst the ISPs. Also, it allows the members to build connections between their facilities throughout town without relying on an ISP to do that. Also, we made redundancy a very important part of our network. Just about all of the links are redundant in a loop fashion so that we can survive cuts. That way we don't have to deal with those calls and having to rush to fix something in a few hours. It served us very well. We also stressed on trying to keep the costs low and the administrative costs low. So there is no staff, mainly volunteers. And there were a lot of impacts to members because of this. There was the shared middle mile fiber from Madison to Platteville provided both public and private growth opportunities. I think one of the biggest impacts was that there was a lot of indirect benefits in the area because it encouraged additional private investment by other companies. So once this cable was put in, Win, who is a provider to many telephone companies and cellular providers, found it very beneficial, and they leveraged what Packerland had in place, but then they also built out additional cables worth probably just as much as more, heading north and heading southwest. So there are, as part of this, at least 3 major cables now coming in and out of Platteville, and it's becoming a pretty big interchange point in Southwest Wisconsin. So it also provided essential services for UW Platteville. I mean, it secured our future immensely. We don't have to worry about bandwidth. We can provide or do disaster recovery at remote sites. So for instance, UW Platteville, our disaster recovery site is actually UW Oshkosh. We have a rack up there and our backups occur over this fiber optics to get up there. So it's very remote. In addition to that, there's other UWs that use our site as a backup site. Oshkosh has their backups at our campus in our data center, and Whitewater has also got their backups as well as an active data center in our data center here in Platteville. So it allows the UW to share resources more effectively. And also we took advantage of these other cables to provide redundancy to this network as well. Since recently, UW Sysnet just completed a major upgrade. It was planned every 7 years, and this is 10 years now since the inception of this, where we brought in multiple, a DWDM system capable of multiple 100 gigabit links that passes through Platteville, and it actually loops back around through northern Illinois and back up through Rockford and Janesville. So we actually have a 100 gig link that passes through here. The city of Platteville was also obviously able to build a network, integrate its facilities, create major applications that were shared across those facilities like VoIP system, access high-speed internet from an ISP. The Southwest Health Center, although wasn't an original partner in this, after the grant they joined in, they were able to connect their clinics, able to get high-speed connectivity for their radiology healthcare records with St. Mary's in Madison and also in Janesville. So it was very instrumental to their growth and able to service their customers and bring modern and advanced technology into the area. So Jerry did mention about the challenges. I hate to bring these up because I don't want to rehash old arguments or try and stir up past things. There were a lot of challenges. A lot of them were political. Another thing that happened because of this was UW and WISNet was severed, and that really hindered the sharing of resources. And that was very unfortunate. We ended up having to build a separate network because of it. There was also a brief lawsuit from Access Wisconsin that tried to stop the project as well. There was very little technical difficulties in the project. There was obviously a lot of these projects funded, and so getting fiber was a bit problematic at times, but we were able to acquire all the fiber we needed. There was an interesting halt to the project because of the Karner blue butterfly in the northern part in the Eau Claire area. Because this was a consolidated project, all communities that was part of this grant had to halt construction. And so that took an additional environmental study and corrective action plan. And frankly, we were very conservative in our timeframes and what it would take to do this project. So we were able to accommodate those delays. Another thing, of course, is federal grants have a lot of requirements, which continue to this day and into the future for reporting requirements, but it also had a lot of labor, environmental permitting, and purchasing restrictions. And then also building a nonprofit organization to govern this, it actually takes quite a bit of time, and we do meet monthly. It can be challenging to get people to volunteer to sit on the board and such. It is time consuming. Here's my lessons learned. Involve your legislatures early. Get their vision and support in the project. We should have probably built bigger and larger. There was a lot of demand. We have actually utilized almost all the fiber in our network and wish that we would have built much larger. Develop your private partnerships early. Get their investment, get some of the cash from them. Of course, applying to these grants always happens in a very short time frame. You don't have a lot of time to get support from people. get buy-in from people. So it's beneficial if you can develop those in advance of the grant opportunities that come along. I think there's a great need for low-cost entry for small entities to participate, even in existing networks. I think it would be great to see some small grants that are easy to apply for to just get that lateral in from a fiber optic line that happens to pass very nearby, probably right in front of their facility, and get them on the CAN so that they can then take advantage of some of these ISPs and the competition that it provides. Proposing and designing a CAN can require a lot of expertise that your small communities just don't have. You need industry partners to reach out and help develop these plans. And also, groups like us that have done it in the past can help to some degree. But it is important, I think, to instill into these providers that more can be done if they work together and work with communities, particularly when it comes to, servicing maybe emergency responder needs, 911, police departments, and community needs. And then truly rural access is difficult to achieve without having problems with return on investment. Providers are not going to be able to get a return on it. Wireless technology is probably maybe a better approach, maybe even satellite technology. But those are things that might actually reach there more cost effectively. Also, you got a lot of these long haul links that go right past smaller communities. And I think if you can make some requirements to try and get ISPs to come into that area as part of getting money to build that long haul connection, maybe they can recruit some third parties, or maybe some startups can handle it. But it should, I think, be an important point rather than pass a community to try and get something in there as part of the grant. And expectations are huge when you start these projects. People think it is easy to do, and it is not, and it's very expensive to do. So I'll leave it at that if there's any questions.
Thank you, Dan. We have time for 1 or 2 questions. Great. So hearing none, I'm going to move over to my presentation really quick. Yes, go ahead.
Should mention, okay, so there was another group that was going to present. It was Corey Heigl from Astria, who was, part of this original. He was a big partner in the BCCB project, the private partner. Unfortunately, he had a family member that fell ill and couldn't attend. But I did want to mention, it's great to have private partners. And one of the things that they have actually been able to do in relation to RCAN is they are now, because they were part of that middle mile build, they are actually building now in Platteville this year. They have decided to invest millions of dollars to build a competing network with CenturyLink. And they have been, over the winter here, directional boring, even outside this window, installing conduit and fiber optics to build a residential access network in Platteville. So great to hear the city council worked tirelessly to try and recruit a private provider in this area. So thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you for adding that one last piece. All right, so I'm going to bring up the rear for the presentations and try to keep brief. But as we were discussing, this next layer, it's not necessarily probably just one community that's working on this. Now we're talking about multiple communities working together. You heard from the 2 presentations of a past round of grants that have already been completed, that there's a fair amount of collaboration that needs to happen. And so Even in the report, there were conversations about local and regional partners. And so what is really happening inside of the state of Wisconsin? So in preparing for this leg of the conversation, we were looking at some regional examples, maybe outside of the state of Wisconsin. And we actually asked the USDA what they're seeing in regional work. And it's an emerging layer of strategy for most of the states, but I think it has a lot of benefits. So I'll tell you all what's happening right now. This is the slide that I presented last time. So, you know, there's the local that we keep talking about. There are the state agencies, and you heard how the DOT is part of some of the solutions for these past projects that were related to NTIA, but there's the regional level as well. So who would be part of that conversation? And I want to then just move to the map that we've already seen of the WEDC PSC broadband pilot map. When we're thinking about the infrastructure build out piece, specifically for access, because perhaps the infrastructure is not there, you can see that the need is all across the state, right? Possibly not in more urban centers, because they do have a lot of competition from the different providers, but it is from one side of to the other on the state. So the partners have to be able to cover that vast difference. So I'm sorry, that's funny. So we brought together in a series of conversations, the regional planning commissions, along with the regions of economic development. What you can see from these two maps is that by bringing these two entities together, you can really overlap and hit every single part of the state. The regional planning commissions, I'm sure a lot of you are well aware of their services. They do work with the municipalities on a number of different initiatives. They're really related to the federal EDA program, and that's where they get a lot of their funding. You'll also note these detailed pieces in black. Those are the MPOs. So those are metropolitan planning organizations. So I would suggest if there's an urban area that's having some issues, the MPO could be at the table. We're working on that kind of broad coverage scale. So these two entities were probably the right people to start bringing together regionally. I will also note that you will easily see that there's lots of overlap. So just looking at Visions Northwest and the Northwest Planning Commission, they're actually run underneath the same roof. If you look at Central Wisconsin, it is comprised almost entirely of Centergy and Grow North. Centergy's office is in the Planning Commission office. And so there was a real synergy by bringing these two organizations together, because in so many instances, there were some strengths and supports that were flowing back and forth between these two organizations. It would also be a misstep and not in saying it was going to be all regional planning commissions, because in some places the natural support is actually the Regional Economic Development Corporation rather than the Regional Planning Commission. So it was better to bring these two entities together and have a good conversation. So what are the benefits of working at this regional level for broadband supports? And again, we're going to get to accessibility, affordability, and adoptability, right? So it honors the local autonomy that we have all the way down to the local level, right? So there are specific community needs, economic mix is different. There's a mix of urban and rural and kind of hybrid and suburban areas. And a lot of times the regional support has a good understanding of some of the nuances inside of that. I believe last year we talked a little bit about how USDA Reconnect is a program from the federal level that probably the state of Wisconsin could access more. So, and just really quickly, just making sure I had this correct, I'd looked at most of the recent awards at the USDA Reconnect level, And there were some small ones, probably a couple $100,000, but the average size of those projects is in the multiple millions of dollars. And what I would assume that would mean that it has to be a multi-county or a regional effort in order to be really competitive. The PSC grants, especially with the expansion of funding that we've seen in the last year, most of the grants are still around that six-figure, a very hefty six-figure level. Some are getting up to the $4 to $6 million level. But as Dan just said, these are expensive. And so if we have more supports working to organize at these different levels, that will be really great. And then we are really recognizing that having that regional blanket, it could really bubble up common concerns up to state agencies to help create solutions and programs. And so I'm sorry, I'm jumping all over the place. It's not working very well today. So this group actually started meeting just in August of 2021. So actually after the report was released. So again, regions of economic development and the regional planning coming together on a monthly level, but it's a little bit more right now. We started by sharing best practices. So Iowa County and with their regional planning commission did a really great job of mapping at the county level. And so we brought them in to talk through some of the techniques that they were doing. We'll talk about the Brown County model with the pilot of geo software. And what really is emerging as well is that we're really recommending that counties start to have more activity from their GIS practitioners and that county level so that we get that blanketing aspect. And almost every single county in the state has someone who does GIS because it's that important. We're trying to figure out how that works. New North, which is an economic development organization at the regional level, did do a regional broadband plan. It was EDA funded and it's wrapping up. New North oversees 18 counties. So that process is pretty vast. And you'll see it in the next map as well. So there's going to be findings that come from that as well. And then we secured geo software for all 72 counties in the state of Wisconsin. So right now we're starting the deployment of this application and really helping local communities use this as a broadband planning tool. So there's two steps to the geo software. The public facing is the speed test. So it is crowdsourced. So you will be hearing that we will be putting out this speed test push. The information is forthcoming. It's going to start really very soon. But once the state map is populated, we'll be able to start using step 2, which is the back end tool. And so on the local level side for those communities that have a broadband committee, they are gaining access to the back end software to help create their broadband plans. There are some really advanced tools inside of that. So we're doing training sessions for everyone. I'll just point out on this map that you will see that, this section of the states is really pretty well covered. That's the New North territory that I just mentioned that is doing a broadband plan. And so they used geo software as part of the tool. Madison moved really quickly, and then Marathon County was very happy and ready to go. So they've done a really good job even before we get to that statewide push. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what happened with Brown County. They are the pilot for the whole entire state. New North had them pilot it to decide if that was going to be one of the software tools that they used. So in step 1, that first year, Brown County did a really great speed test accumulation. And when we're talking about speed tests, we all know that speed tests have a lot of, if you're looking at a single speed test, it really depends on how close they are to the modem, if they're using Wi-Fi, the age of the equipment. There's a lot of items that come into play. But what we're really interested in the difference between the green, which is good, and the red, which doesn't necessarily have enough connectivity. And what is the strategy to close the gap? Step 2, then they use GIS to map out what it would look like if they did a complete infrastructure build out. So the red dotted lines are the proposed future fiber optic design. It's on GIS, so I put a couple of the different layers on it so that you can see the municipality buildings, the fire stations, the commercial sites that they're kind of pushing. So you understand where they want to go. And as far as I understand, this is the kind of the around Green Bay itself. There's a lot of fiber in the ground. So it's then again, that expanded area. And from what I've heard, yes, they're using this for grant applications. And then also providers are looking at this map and just quickly coming to the table and doing their build outs, which are probably adjacent to where they're working already. Step 3 is most recent, and this is because they're the most mature deployment of this. Recently in an email, they said, hey, these are the areas that we don't have enough tests, and they went to their partners and they have those circled areas they're now going to target with community members and the community organizations that they partner with, and try to get information from those areas so that they can then really understand what's happening. And so what is the hope for all of this? So easily, what you heard from Danielle's conversation is that, there's a lot of planning that needs to happen on the local level. Better tools for planning is what we're trying to get to the local level, especially with this. And with this information, we can drive participation from the providers and really target those communities that we know there's need. And there's no, the visibility is there to understand the need rather than feeling like you're in the dark. We'll be able to really work with communities and say, hey, this is an area that we've taken the speed tests. We know that this is an area of concern. Maybe there's an adjacent fiber line. How can we work together to get there? And, we want to make sure that technical assistance is used very well. And this is actually one of the better tools that we found. But we want to make sure that that the blend of state and federal funds that we're going to see with the infrastructure dollars really helps multiple counties work together, again, because there is the middle mile piece of the infrastructure bill. There's going to be different types of funding, and we want to just make sure that that's available for everyone. So I wanted to make sure that people knew that as we move into kind of solutions thinking, there are some currently active things that are happening. I'm happy to answer some quick questions before we move on to the next process about that regional process that's happening and occurring. Well, hearing none, I am going to hand it over to Kristen because she will start the process and we're going to get deeper into conversation with each other.
Thank you, Brittany, and thank you both to Danielle and thank you to Dan for participating and bringing us this wonderful information today. It has been fantastic, and there's a lot that I think we're going to unpack in the next few minutes as we discuss in groups today. So I am going to drop the link to the Google document back in the chat again and give us our charge for small discussion. So as I think will be our tradition, after hearing our speakers today, we're going to go into small group discussions and then come back into large group discussion. So hopefully while we were listening to our speakers today, we were listening for pain points, but also listening for solutions. Some of these might correspond with some of the information that you put on your homework. Some might be problems or pain points that you hadn't thought of before, but tuned into while we were speaking today. Some might be solutions that you've heard are pretty effective or you've implemented yourself as solutions, or things that are new to you. So with that, we've got two questions. First question we'll discuss for about 10 minutes in our small groups, and then come back and debrief as a large group, then go into our second question and come back to a large group and defeat. So that first question will be, what are the solutions that we should be bringing to the table or working to deploy? Are these state level solutions, regional level solutions, local level solutions, provider level solutions? And one of the things that we'd like to ask you to think about is, just because something is difficult or might seem difficult, that doesn't mean we shouldn't consider it. Let's put those solutions on the table as well. We've got the ability to tackle some big problems. So we are going to randomly assign everyone to one of 4 groups. When you get into the Google document, you should note the group number that you have. We have a facilitator from the PSC that is going to be with every group, and they'll help make notes on the Google document. Again, the Google document is our temporary workspace, so we'll be taking these down after we're done presenting today, preserving them for our own notes and our own use, and also for public records. So with that, we've got about 10 minutes to discuss. Jaron, are you ready to send us into small groups?
Yes, thank you, Kristen. I will just briefly say we do have 4 groups. I've got them assigned. I'll open them up in just a minute. We've got PSC facilitators. Milena will be facilitating room 1, Alyssa Kenny with room 2, Coulter Sikora room 3, and Kath Kittle room 4. And I've got those rooms all ready to go. So if we are ready, Brittany, I can open those up and people should receive an invitation to join, and you can click that.
Great. I think we're ready.
All right. We'll have 10 minutes. I will open those up. And I will say, if we have any members of the public, you are welcome to join a breakout room if you would like. I would just, you just need to let me know, and I can put you in a room at random, or if you'd like a specific room, just let me know. And I will say, any of the PSC representatives, if you would like to join a room, just let me know. Otherwise, if you don't, that's fine too.
Did you have great discussions? I hope so. I was watching on Google and was excited by the notes. So per our last meeting, we will do a debrief by calling on a group or having a group step forward to talk about what they talked about. Do we have any volunteers before we call on a group? All right, let's start in the middle this time. Group 2, would you mind reporting out first, and then you'll call on the next group?
That's me. Unless somebody else from our group wants to chime in. We talked briefly about collaboration being needed really on all layers, and developing many layers of partnership across federal, state, economic, community, just all the institutions. And just the way that you might build those partnerships is knowing a lot of different people and knowing a lot of different organizations. And so to have those kind of nodes and connectors involved with your project is really key. We talked about the need for good data and some excitement around the GeoPartners tool that was shared. The limitations of the census block mapping that the FCC have been using, and any strategies that we can have to really identify the real pockets of need. And then finally, that there's increasing red tape for projects that's making some of the public funding not worth the work. And it might be better for some providers in some cases to self-fund and not to deal with the additional lien requirements that the PSC is requiring, or the additional hoops that the Reconnect program makes people jump through. Anyone else from group 2 want to chime in and add anything I missed? Can I pass to group 3? Oh, Marta?
I was just going to give you a thumbs up and just say you got it. You're good.
I could pass it to 3.
Sure, I can give it a whirl. I'll go ahead and give the Cliff Note versions off what I wrote, but if anybody from Group 3 wants to step in when I'm done, please do so. So the bigger highlights that I saw are trying to whip up, or trying to read it off verbatim here. What can be done by regional and state partners to support the citizen volunteers, civil servants, elected officials, the folks who are probably juggling a whole bunch of other responsibilities? What can we do as state and regional entities to help them plan broadband? Lori threw in a comment along kind of similar lines, really providing a mechanism to better educate local folks who are doing their planning, a go-to support system. Getting into Jose's commentary a little bit, and there's a lot of notes in here. I'm only going through the highlights of it. But really, I'm trying to interpret this right now. Ultimately, having more comprehensive planning with all the stakeholders involved relatively early on, so that as communities, whether it be at the local level or at a more regional or large scale, basically having as many stakeholders at the table early on to basically have a comprehensive planning approach from the get-go. And this can, of course, include providers as well. If my memory while working on mapping projects is right from earlier in this meeting, I believe with what Jerry presented in Wausau, there was an example where there were a couple of internet providers doing work at least sort of together while still being competitive with each other. And while we also have to acknowledge that, especially in really rural areas, to cite some notes from Chad, in really rural areas, almost pushing for too much competition is really hurting the economic case in some instances. There are still opportunities based on the strengths of individual private sector entities or other stakeholders to really work with each other, even though they may be competitive, by way of leveraging their individual strengths, to say like a backhaul provider or somebody who's got the east side of Wausau well covered, or, you know, versus the west side. I'm sure like in unique local situations and county and regional situations, you're coming up with different results, you know, in each scenario. But if you have your stakeholders at the table and a pretty large group of them from the get-go, I think that helps make a common goal and get a common solution going that is capturing hopefully everybody's needs. Anybody else from Group 3 want to fill in on that? Silence is golden, question mark. All right, let's kick this over to Group 4. Kath?
And Kath, I think you're muted.
Yes, I am. Thanks, Colder. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, hopefully, in case anybody from my team wanted to do the report out. No, and I'm still getting an error message, so that isn't going to happen. All right, I'll go ahead unless somebody wants to go from memory.
I can share mine if it would help, Kath.
That's okay. I've got it all written down here. So,
okay, just for reference.
Yeah, we talked about partnerships being important, the public-private, and that, you know, it's a statewide kind of thing. Understanding the different laws as well. I think somebody already mentioned that or alluded to it. Finding out what is possible and when needs worked out. And then leverage the info we already have, kind of, you know, what's already been done. And then the last two were kind of like identify what to solve for, like overlapping areas and that kind of thing. Identify an area that definitely needs service and what areas do not do not meet that area of service, and then really define the goal. And that really can be boiled down to having a plan before grant funds are applied for, because there's oftentimes not enough time to do it once an announcement has been made. You know, they kind of need to have that information compiled before you start in. So that was what we talked about. Did I miss anything, anybody? Anything anybody wants to add? If not, I'll turn it over to Milena.
Thank you, Kat. We were very lucky in this group because we have Brittany, so she's our repository memory. So please, if you want to go ahead and report, that's fine for me. Whatever you prefer, Brittany.
Sure, I can do that. So we talked about, Tom Boron was on our group as well, and he also was involved with the CAN, and he mentioned that last mile is still really difficult even in that situation, and it's from the reports or the presentations, those shared agreements are really key to bringing in the private sector and the providers into those public-private partnerships as they were. And there are some real mysteries around that. So Chris Meyer brought up, for communities that have some of that dark fiber, there's not really an incentive inside of that, and they don't necessarily know the appropriate relationship and the deal that should be struck if they were to look at that. And there are some providers who really need to make sure that they own the whole entire process, and it's really difficult for them to have the markers of a process that could be really good for a shared use of part of the fiber optic cables. So we talked about, so there needs to be more insight about how to build those shared agreements for communities and how that could be really very beneficial. And then, again, it came also, we were talking about what really just the interrelation of all of the different organizations and when and how to bring all of those players to the table, and doing it as early as possible is probably key. And I think I'm the last for that round.
I think you are. Thank you very much, all of you, for the conversation and for sharing. I think we've got a lot of vibrant ideas here. So let's implement these, or let's talk about maybe implementing these. So question 2 for today's discussion: what is needed to apply these solutions? Let's not assume that all tools or solutions or programs or services are always the most useful at the local level. What types of tools or solutions can we offer to regions or providers so that we can offer assistance to all levels that need it? So with that, I think we do have time for another 10-minute discussion. So let's go back into groups for 10 minutes, and then we'll come out for a quick debrief so that we can get through our last 2 agenda items.
All right, the room's just opened up again. Should have the same folks each room. Please let me know if you have any questions.
Okay, so I've got my timer start. Welcome back, everyone. Looks like there was great conversation going on again. And in the interest of time, Brittany, since you were the last, I'm going to call on you to go first this time.
Great. All right. I was just trying to get off a quick chat message, but I think I got it back at the same time. So our group took what we were having in a conversation, but we were talking about those like shared agreements. How do we get them into the right hands? And we were thinking, okay, if municipalities are the ones who need more information, then maybe the League of Municipalities and Towns Associations, County Associations needs to be at the table, and maybe it's an information session about sharing those fiber optic cables with them. Chris mentioned the electric utilities are also someone to consider. I personally didn't mention this, but I mentioned that GIS professionals could do more mapping. So there is an ongoing conversation actually with Coulter and the Land Information Officer Association for the state about how they can all play a larger role inside of that. And then we started talking about what this all looks like and the planning, and there needs to be this is staff time and, clarity and directives that need to be communicated into the providers. If they need information, they need, sometimes their staff has to check some of those sharing agreements. So that needs to be a directive if that's going to be something that is really interesting. But we also talked about the infrastructure dollars and how it's all flowing, and a need to really understand what it looks like for the state of Wisconsin and some of those plans, so we can start, thinking about the nodes that are going to start to bubble up because of that funding. And, if we heard over and over, get the people to the table as early as possible to put those partnerships together. So as much as could be understood inside of the funding flow down of the infrastructure dollars, that would be beneficial. I'm gonna hand this over to, I'm just gonna go to number 2.
I think that's me and our group. Really quick, we talked about the maybe personnel challenges, particularly with small providers, around the technical experience. They've got good technical experience to run their business, but maybe not coordinate a partnership with a community and write a grant. We talked about wanting to both pay that expert to do that, and how do you find the right person? We can build templates and one-stop shops and guides, but then how do you have the personnel to kind of make that work? We talked about just sort of the chronic issues right now around materials, supply chain costs going up, and just the risks or challenges with continuing to add money to that marketplace with the infrastructure bill. Is that going to make costs go up higher and supply chains get harder? So just considering what's going to happen. We talked a little bit about middle mile, as I saw other groups did. We talked a little bit about the opportunity to maybe have some loan programs as a way to help providers with cash flow, particularly around as a remedy for some of the supply chain stuff. And then the idea of, can we certify good actors or sort of certain sets of providers, and then remove some of the red tape for them and provide them kind of like a fast lane once they make that certification, as an idea. So I think if anyone else wants to chip in or clarify anything I said, I hope I got it right. Can I pass to 3 again?
Sure. Try to sprint through mine too. We'll see how this goes. The idea of having a checklist of how I can bring stakeholders together, really kind of following a guideline or navigation tool to help make that happen, I think was something our group found would be helpful. One question that Jose brought up that he didn't feel like he got out in the questions is, are there resources for making a budgeting plan that we should work on having in mind? And also, it's just a good idea to try to see what folks in other states have done, especially early pioneers of this as well. Chad and I each had similar comments from different perspectives. His was that a lot of the counties and local units that are just getting to this are kind of recreating the wheel. And it would be nice if we could streamline some of that, perhaps by having, if you will, kind of county broadband communities that are relatively uniform across the counties, working to swap ideas through a forum, say like at the Wisconsin Counties Association. I stepped in and said, well, we've been mapping broadband coverage data sets on a granular level now for a little bit, and that's getting more and more advanced. I think we should do the same with broadband providers, which is something I've made no secret of when I've been on the phone with the provider community. And I think we're making movement towards that, even with the FCC standard coming, really to help with that too. Having an inventory of permitting, middle mile, dark fiber, also helpful for especially the provider community, but really probably across all stakeholders. And then a little bit echoing the first comments that we had, really kind of building up a repository of resource guides, mapping data, planning documents, and best practice guides, et cetera, would be super helpful for getting all these entities to make their work process a little bit easier and maybe not recreate so many wheels. And I think that leaves us with group 4.
Yep. So hi. So for group 4, one of the items we had was mapping is key, whether it's at the statewide level, but also local level mapping, like identifying anchor locations, not necessarily community anchor institutions. And then also a side note on that, the ARPA awards are still showing as eligible, and then the changing maps is kind of problematic at times. We also talked about needing technical expertise and support at the community level, that local level. And then of course it must fit into a budget with funding sources, for everything to work. And that finishes our group.
Thank you. And with that, Brittany, I will turn it back over to you.
Great. So the next steps for this is, our next meeting will have another set of homework. I think we're getting to this need to understand the relationships that are probably out there, and we'll start to kind of work on that side of things. We're going to quickly hit the report writing section of this. We're coming up to April. Then we have May and June, and the report is due at the end of June. So we're going to be, in essence, almost shifting gears really quickly to start thinking of how much information we've kind of bubbled up and what some of those recommendations are going to be as clear as possible. So we'll continue on that map. So just so, thank you all for your input. This is, it's very great to have all of these different voices at the table, looking at the problem from all of these different angles, and understanding how they all interrelate is extremely important. So for the sake of, being right at the top of the hour, Jaren, I'm going to hand it over to you for possible public comment, and then we can proceed.
Thank you, Brittany. We'll get through this quick. Now is the time where we will allow for any public comment. Members of the public can go ahead and unmute and make a public comment. I would just ask that it remain brief and pertain to the subject of broadband access. Any public comments? I'm going to do a last call for public comments. I will also note that we do accept public comments in a written fashion. Directions on how to do that is on the task force webpage, along with other information like meeting agendas, recordings, and updates. So unless there are any other final words, I think we can adjourn. Is that okay, Brittany?
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.